Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Fletcher. I'm the Assistant Director in the Center for Renaissance Studies.
Hi, and my name is Analú, María López. I'm the Ayer Indigenous Studies Librarian here at the Newberry.
And in this collection presentation, we'll be talking to you about how you can use archival sources and collections like the Newberries to think about how people tried to be heard and take up space in the past and today. For this pair of objects, we want to talk about how the physical qualities of these historical sources have a lot to tell us about their success in being able to speak for the people who created them back in their day. We'll start with this, which is one of the famous 1520 pamphlets by Martin Luther. The situation for Luther as he entered the summer of 1520 was this. He knew that the papal inquiry into his theological beliefs had concluded and that he was to be decried as a heretic in an official bull from the papacy that would be printed and spread throughout all of the German lands. To get ahead of the story, Luther created 3 important pamphlets, and it was important that he chose to do pamphlets. These were smaller objects, as you can see here, not gigantic treatises. They could be printed quickly, they could be sold cheaply, and they could spread to a much larger audience than any other sort of theological work at the time. This allowed Luther to reach a wide number of readers before the papal bull made it into Germany. It also gave him the opportunity, as you see here, to put his image next to his words. And in this case, the image of a very pious, learned, and peaceful man next to words calling for the reduction of the sacraments, which were very revolutionary ideas, was a big factor in his favor. Luther used these pamphlets to literally take up intellectual space in Germany. And through them, he was able to claim a large swath of the territories from the papacy before the bull even arrived. In fact, in Luther's university town of Erfurt, a large cart bearing many copies of the papal bull was seized and thrown into the river by people who had been reached by, read, and engaged with Luther's important 1520 pamphlets such as this one.
Okay, next what we have here is a great example of speech's protest tied to Native American and Indigenous rights here in Chicago. Created on birch bark by Potawatomi leader Simon Pokagon in 1893 during the World's Fair in Chicago, he used this extremely public opportunity to advocate for his people's rights. When Simon Pokagon attended the fair in Chicago, he was outraged that no Native American had been asked to serve in any official capacity at this World's Fair when dignitaries had come from all over the world to attend. Native people only participation at this point was only really as props. There were what they called native villages, along with many other ethnic villages, situating native people in the past. That is, they were placed in these zoo-like villages where visitors can see how Indians used to live prior to contact. Challenged by this insult, Pokagon sat down and wrote what was perhaps the most eloquent defense of the Native American ever written, while also situating Native people in the present, reminding everyone that Chicago is Native land, while also criticizing the fair greatly. He called it the Red Mans Rebuke, then later the name was changed to the Red Mans Greeting. I also want to point out the material it's made out of. You'll see that we have 2 here. The top is actually the facsimile, and the original is at the bottom. The original is made on birch bark, and Pokagon mentioned why he actually created it on birch bark, and it was meant as a tribute to his people, but also as to the birch bark itself. He's quoted as saying, quote, "My object in publishing the Red Man's Greeting on the bark of the white birch tree is out of loyalty to my own people. Birch bark was and continues to be a very important resource to the Anishinaabe people. Some scholars have even often mentioned the choice of it being printed on birch bark is in itself a signal of resistance by using this important tree as a powerful symbol of indigenous life in the Great Lakes region." Pokagon also presented this pamphlet orally to around 75,000 people at the fair, and also sold it at the fair after being invited to be the keynote speaker for Chicago Day by the mayor at the time, Carter Harrison. I also want to point out that he did initially advocate for $2,000 be advocated for an entire delegation of Native people to come to the fair to speak on their own behalf, but in the end, he was the only one that was invited. Pokagon also presented the mayor with the 1833 facsimile of the Treaty of Chicago on birch bark. The next portion is, I want to read a little section out of it, but he's quoted as saying, within the book, it starts off in the beginning, In behalf of my people, the American Indians, I hereby declare to you, the pale-faced race that has usurped our lands and homes, that we have no spirit to celebrate with you the great Columbian Fair, now being held in the city of Chicago, the wonder of the world. No sooner would we hold the high joy day over the graves of our departed fathers than to celebrate our own funeral, the discovery of America. And while your hearts in admiration rejoice over the beauty and grandeur of this young republic, and you say, behold the wonders wrought by our children in this foreign land, do not forget that this success has been at the sacrifice of our homes and a once happy race. The booklet caught the attention of many Chicago presses, was reviewed at length by the national press, and was quoted eventually by journals in England and Europe. It made Pokagon somewhat of a world celebrity, but was also very important to remember is how this pamphlet addressed issues Native people faced, and Simon Pokagon advocating on behalf of his people while also addressing settler colonialism. You can see this entire pamphlet digitized in its entirety on our American Indian Indigenous Studies collection, digital database, along with many other works written by Pokagon.
For this pairing of items, we're going to talk in general about how texts, both oral and written, can speak for the people who create them well past whatever physical spot they happen to be occupying. This is a great example from the Middle Ages of just that. It's a manuscript of the Constellation of Philosophy, one of the most important works of medieval intellectual history by Boethius, an author, statesman, and writer in the service of the Ostrogothic king Theodoric in the 5th century. Boethius wrote this text while he was imprisoned for undermining King Theodoric, and is a text that Boethius wrote to console himself and also express his great learning of Greek literature. This became one of the most important texts of medieval intellectual history. It was copied, recopied, and was in many ways one of the sole sources of Greek intellectual learning, which Boethius knew well, throughout the rest of the Middle Ages until the 13th century. This is a copy that was made 600 years after Boethius wrote his initial text in Germany. And you can see in this 11th century copy how people continued to engage with it, writing numerous notes in the margins along with the text. This became a very influential and important text, and it originated when its author was imprisoned and unable to go out and share his learning with other people. So he created this particular text in order to do that for him. And it did it spectacularly well, making sure that Boethius and his ideas maintained a presence in Europe for centuries after his untimely death.
Okay, next we have a poem titled Mi último pensamiento, created in 1896 by José Rizal Mercado y Alonso Realondo, or otherwise known as José Rizal. Rizal was a Filipino nationalist tagged as the national hero by the Filipino people during the tail end of the Spanish colonial period of the Philippines. An ophthalmologist by profession, Rizal became a writer on a key member of the Filipino propaganda movement, which advocated basically for political reforms for the colony under Spain. Rizal was also a polyglot and a polymath, fluent in 22 languages, and was skilled in both science and the arts. This piece was one of the last notes Rizal created the day before his execution by firing squad on December 30th, 1896. He was executed by the Spanish colonial government for the crime of rebellion after the Philippine Revolution, inspired in part by his writings, broke out. Though he was not actively involved in its planning or conduct, he ultimately approved of its goals, which eventually led to Philippine independence. And I just want to quote something he said, and he wrote in his final letter. He said, "Tomorrow at 7 I shall be shot, but I am innocent of the crime of rebellion. I am going to die with a tranquil conscience." Rizal is believed to be the first Filipino revolutionary whose death is attributed entirely to his work as a writer, and through dissent and civil disobedience enabled him to successfully destroy Spain's moral primacy to rule. His most famous works were his two novels, Noli Me Tangere, written in Spanish, depicting the social life of Filipinos during this time, and its sequel, which was titled El Filibusterismo, a much darker novel, is more aggressive in its depiction of the call for change. These two novels which the first one was written in 1887, and the second were scathing indictments of Spanish tyranny and of the church, which came to acquire immense political power during this time. Both novels have symbolized the oppression, the double standards of society, the inequalities, and the desire for change. These books were banned by the Spanish authorities, including the Catholic Church, because it was, for them, blasphemous and seditious. Nowadays, these books that he wrote are read in high school as part of the curriculum. Once you read and analyze the books, it still shows the symbolism Rizal used in portraying the cancer of our society, which is still prevalent today. I've always been fascinated by Rizal's story, and specifically this broadside that we have at the Newberry. On the afternoon of December 29th, 1896, the day before his execution, Dr. Rizal was visited by his mother, sisters, and his nephews. When they took their leave, Rizal told his sister in English that there was something in the small alcohol stove, the cocinilla, as opposed to saying alcohol lamp, lamparia, which was intended to provide a cover for the transportation of this text that you see here. The stove was given to his mother by the guard when they were about to board for their carriage in the courtyard. At home, the Rizal ladies recovered from that stove that he gave them this folded piece of paper. On it was written an unsigned, untitled, and undated poem of 14 5-line stanzas. The Rizals reproduced copies of the poem and sent them to Rizal's friends in the country and abroad. In 1887, a friend of Rizal had the poem printed with the title Mi Último Pensamiento. Another friend who received a copy of the poem, which was a prisoner at the time, published it in the first issue of La Independencia on September 25th, 1898, with the title Último Adiós.
This pairing of items is going to talk about how the texts that people produced in the past in order to make themselves heard and take up space were sometimes used for purposes quite other than what was intended for them when they were created. This is a good example from the 16th century. This is a Bible printed by the Anglican bishop William Fulke in 1589. It is a copy of the New Testament, but as you'll see on the pages, there are actually two versions of the New Testament. Over here on the right, in the italics, is the, at the time, accepted Protestant translation of the Bible, the Bishop's Bible. And on the right is another translation that was made by a group of English Catholic refugees living in France. This version of the New Testament was printed in 1582 from the French city of Reims, and it was very controversial in England. Fulke had set his entire intellectual career around disproving Catholicism and driving it out of England. So when he encountered this new English translation of the Bible, he did what he felt he had to do in order to refute it. That meant putting the words of the erroneous Catholics next to the words of the extremely correct Protestants, alongside copious marginal notes where Fulke would be able to, in detail, show people how the Catholics were wrong and the Protestants were right. And we can see that in the notes here, where we have the Rem annotation followed immediately by Fulke's answer to it. However, in producing this book, Fulke also gave the Reims translation a much wider circulation than it ever would have achieved on its own. Instead of having to be squirreled in from France and circulated secretly, it could be sold openly, printed by official royal printers, and acquired by a much larger group of people. We can even imagine English recusants, so secret Catholics, taking this book and putting it on their bookshelves without fear of being discovered, because after all, it was a book produced by an Anglican bishop. So this is an example of a kind of how a kind of book might not achieve the exact result that their creators had in mind when it was produced.
Okay, so this is probably one of my favorite books at the Newberry, and one I think often gets overlooked by some. It is quite literally the first book and dictionary to be printed on this continent, the Americas, in 1555, and again in 1571 in Mexico. Mexico, La Ciudad de Mexico to be specific. This bilingual dictionary of Spanish and Nahuatl was created by Alonso de Molina with the assistance of Hernando de Rivas, a Nahua from Texcoco, who also helped many other friars with their translations in Nahuatl, Spanish, and Latin. The Molina was a Franciscan priest and grammarian. Molina was born in Spain, but he arrived in Mexico still as a child during the Spanish invasion of Mexico. He grew up playing with the monolingual Nahuatl-speaking children in Tenochtitlan, so he became a fluent speaker of the language. Later, after entering the Franciscan convent, he also taught at El Colegio de Santa Cruz de Tlatelolco, along with many other well-known individuals, such as Bernardino de Sahagún, Andrés de Olmos, Juan de Gaona, and Juan Badiano, also an important Nahuatl student who translated one of the first herbal books into Latin from Nahuatl. So this book here was originally titled Aquí comienza un vocabulario en la lengua castellana y mexicana. When they're saying lengua mexicana or Mexican languages, they do mean the Nahuatl language. And later it was changed to vocabulario en lengua castellana y mexicana. It was also edited by Juan Pablos, the first documented printer in the Americas, which started the printing press arrived in Mexico in 1539. The most famous edition is probably the one made in 1571. So in the beginning I mentioned how there's two copies, and I think this one gets overlooked sometimes. This one is the first edition, 1555, and then there's a subsequent edition in 1571. The newest edition, that's a 1571, the later one, the main difference being that while this one has a Spanish to Nahuatl entry of roughly about 16,000 words entered, the second edition includes also in the back a Nahuatl to Spanish, and it's somewhere around 22,000 entries for that one. This book is considered the first published systematic approach to an indigenous language. It is still considered an indispensable tool for students of classical or 16th century Nahuatl. And that's something I find really fascinating in the Yoltequit, or work from the heart I do. When these dictionaries and grammar books were first being created by the friars, they were being created with the intention to better understand the language, but also to aid in the conversion of the indigenous population. One friar is quoted as saying, "Write in the Mexican language whatever would be most useful to the dogma, practice, and continuance of Christianity among the natives of New Spain, and at the same time would be most useful as an aid to the ministers and their helpers charged with teaching them." Just as Chris mentioned, one never knows what these materials will be used for once they are published and put into circulation. I don't think the friars could have ever guessed that these very books intended to convert and assimilate indigenous peoples would later be used to study and relearn one's language. We also use a lot of these 16th century books to look up words that may have fallen out of use or forgotten, and compare them to other words that are maybe used in modern variants today, because that's a lot of the work I do now, is working with modern variant languages that are currently spoken. I find this transformative nature of these books extremely fascinating and encouraging as an indigenous language relearner. Learning a language spoken by my family centuries ago, and as someone who is dedicated to indigenous language preservation, I find these books very, very important in that work.
In this pairing of items, we want to talk about how historical sources that you can find in libraries and archives, like we've been seeing in this presentation, are still very vital to attempts to be heard and take up space even in our contemporary times. What we have here is a late 15th century printed edition of a Latin translation of a letter written by Christopher Columbus after his voyage to what he thought was the Indies. In this letter, as most letters were in this period, this was not simply private correspondence. Columbus wrote this letter as a way to not just tell people about the things that he did, but also to build up an image of himself as a great explorer, an intrepid person, and of course, a good Christian. So it does give an account of Columbus's voyages that later became the basis for many people to use to construct the myth of Columbus as a great explorer, a benign sort of seeker of knowledge, as opposed to what he actually did, which was the brutal enslavement, oppression, and destruction of the indigenous societies that he and other Spaniards encountered. But for years, these historical sources were at the heart of the many scholarly efforts to build up Columbus into exactly this type of person, which was then used to create various things such as Columbus Day and the many different statues and cities named after Columbus that you can find throughout the United States even today. Whether Columbus exactly had statues and cities in mind when he wrote the letter is a little unclear, but certainly he intended for this type of historical source to preserve this wonderfully positive image of him for generations and generations to come.
Okay, lastly, what we have here is an image I took while participating in an action that occurred here in Chicago on July 17th of this year. I thought a lot about the questions posed for the symposium when selecting an image. What constitutes speech, what is public space, and how is it policed? How are the boundaries drawn between those who want to be seen and heard and those who want them to remain absent? I think this is really a great example of speech as protests and how colonialism started with Columbus's arrival is very much alive within our very city. So on July 17th, a group of Black, Indigenous, people of color youth, which included the Chi Nations Youth Council, Black Lives Matter Chicago, Black Youth Project, and a dozen other groups organized what was called a Black and Indigenous Solidarity Rally at Buckingham Fountain, which I also attended and participated in. It was promoted on social media as an opportunity for everyone, to dance, sing, party, and celebrate ourselves. It was a very beautiful event, and it brought so many individuals from many different backgrounds around the city of Chicago together, and it is something that in all my years being Chicagoan I have ever seen, which was beautiful. Following the rally, demonstrators, marched to the southern end of Grant Park, where a group of Chicago police stood at guard around the 1933 bronze statue of Christopher Columbus, which had previously been cocooned in plastic, like a plastic tarp, which you can see there. That's that white plastic that it's been wrapped around, and this happened after the statue monument had been vandalized a series of times. A small group of the crowd basically attempted to drive the police away, and the police initially retreated, and the crowd moved onto the ground around the statue. So we moved around the statue after the police kind of stepped aside. Some protesters covered Columbus's pedestal with graffiti, as you see at the bottom, while others attempted to tear it down. And as you notice on the top of the statue, you can kind of see a rope being swung around the statue, and I caught that moment that was happening. It was very exciting and very moving, actually, and important moment. So within about 20 minutes while we were there, the Chicago Police Department did return, and in greater numbers and in full riot gear, and they were basically attempting to disperse the crowd, but they were doing this very violently, and they were also instigating the crowd. So they were the first to move in and attack the protesters, and a lot of this was shared online, social media, and the news, and it was very one-sided. They only showed snippets of what was happening, and tended to side with blaming the protesters that were there, when that wasn't the case. As someone that was on the ground noticing this, the police did actually initiate contact first, and we were simply defending ourselves from pepper spray and batons when they were beating people all over property. Again, I think this is like a really great example of speech as protest, and individuals wanting to be heard on how the continued erasure and effects of colonialism extend out from historical moments in time and are not just past tense, but something that continues to affect our Black, Indigenous communities of color to date. And at times, writing and speaking can only do so much, and actual physical actions are needed to influence change.